Looks like folks are trickling in, so I will go ahead and get started. A very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Hillary Stevens. I am the Coastal Resilience Manager with Restore America's Estuaries, and I'd like to welcome you all to our June webinar. This is very exciting. We've got a researcher whose work is very relevant to those of us who work in salt marshes and to anyone working in the blue carbon field. So again, I'd like to welcome you all. And I'll go ahead and get started just to introduce. Let's see. Okay, again, I'd like to welcome you all. We're going to be hearing about the breathing of a salt marsh, learnings and challenges of carbon dynamics. Because of the large number of attendees, we've got everyone on mute for this webinar. If you have any questions, please enter them. You should see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button, and you can type in questions there. Feel free to enter them at any time during the talk, and at the end, I will be taking questions and giving them to our presenter to answer at that time. We are recording this webinar. So if any of your colleagues or anyone else you know is unable to attend today, you'll be able to find that recording on our YouTube channel. So just go into YouTube, search for Restore America's Estuaries, and you'll see recordings of all of our webinars. So I definitely encourage you to check that out as well. So let me explain to you a little bit about Restore America's Estuaries, and then we'll get straight on into the talk. We are an umbrella organization of 10 member groups located around the country. You see them indicated on the map here, such as the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the Galveston Bay Foundation, Save the Bay San Francisco. We have organizations on the East Coast, the West, and the Gulf Coasts, and they are all working in their local communities to protect and restore their local coastal resources. You'll see at the bottom here, we have a number of affiliate members as well. If your organization is interested in partnering with us, I encourage you to get in touch about that program. We are located in Washington, D.C., and we serve as a convener and an advocate for our member groups and indeed anyone working on coastal resource management. If you're interested in learning more about what we do, please check out our website and connect with us on social media. I'm also very excited to announce our 2021 Living Shorelines Tech Transfer Workshop is going to be held live and in person. We get together, shake hands, and go do field work in October 19th and 20th in beautiful Cape May, New Jersey. This event is an opportunity for anyone working in living shorelines to get together, share lessons learned and knowledge. It's really a roll up your sleeves kind of event. There will be field trips, plenary sessions from experts working in the field. I'd highly encourage you to stay tuned. We expect registration for that to open in the next couple of weeks. We are also looking forward to our 2022 Coastal and Estuarine Summit. Again, live and in person. This past year, we held it virtually and it was a great success, but of course, we miss seeing everyone's faces in person. So that will be in New Orleans. Go ahead and put it on your calendar, and we look forward to seeing you then. Without any further ado, let me get into introducing our speaker because I know that's why you're here. We are going to be hearing today from Professor Rodrigo Vargas. He's an associate professor at the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences at the University of Delaware. He completed his PhD at the University of California-Riverside and a postdoc at the University of California-Berkeley. His research interests focus on how biophysical factors regulate greenhouse gas dynamics in terrestrial and coastal ecosystems. He studies soil-plant atmosphere interactions to understand and quantify the response of ecosystems to management, extreme events, and global environmental change. He's been part of the science steering groups of the North America Carbon Program, North American Forestry Commission, Mexican Carbon Program, and AmeriFlux. You may have seen his research featured recently on NPR or his opinion piece in The Hill, and he'll be talking here today more about that research. His talk is titled The Breathing of the Salt Marsh, Learnings and Challenges About Carbon. And this Research is highly topical to our blue carbon work, and I'm sure that's why many of you are here today. So without further ado, let me pass this over to Professor Vargas.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Can you see the main screen?
Yes, you're all set. Go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much for the invitation from Restore America's History. This is a pleasure to present some of the work that we're doing in my research group. I also want to thank all the participants that are showing up in this webinar. We are now used to this type of interactions where we can reach out to a larger community. I cannot see where people are joining from, but this is a fantastic opportunity to reach out beyond a specific group. So I want to thank all the participants to be here. And I want to talk about a journey of carbon dynamics on some of the things that we have been working on. A little bit of the talk will be general. Some I will present some specific things, more technical aspects, and then I will finish the talk also with some broader implications of monitoring and monitoring and sensing, remote sensing opportunities. And I hope that we have some time for engaging in discussion. My understanding is that you will type your questions in the chat box, and we can have hopefully a good interaction via this webinar. So first of all, I want to start with acknowledgements. I want to thank the sponsors. Most of my research has been funded by the National Science Foundation and also by NASA. But I want to thank also the Delaware National Estuarine Research Reserve in Delaware, which is part of the National Estuarine Research Reserves from NOAA. I also want to thank my students from at the University of Delaware. Specifically, I want to highlight work from Margaret Capucci, Andrew Hill, Branimir Trifunovic, Alma Vasquez-Lule, and Jocelyn Wardrop. This is graduate students that have been working for several years here, and I will present some of their work there. Additionally, I have multiple co-authors and colleagues that I don't have time to mention them, but they know that I have been working for years, and I'm very grateful for having such great friends and colleagues. So I want to start with a motivation of what would be important about this talk, and just keep in mind maybe three challenges or three things to think about, and why we are doing what we are doing at this specific site. The first challenge that I want to discuss is this idea of the boundless carbon cycle. And probably if you are connected in this webinar, you have heard about this idea, thinking about the connectivity between the land and the ocean. We cannot think that processes are independent from the land, independent in the ocean. We have to think about this connectivity and this transfer of mass and energy in this system, in the Earth system, specifically in the interfaces between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. Thinking about the lateral transfer of mass and energy, but also the vertical transfer of mass and energy, and how the processes are involved in the transport of these across watersheds from the land to the ocean, and how those processes interact with each other and influence eventually what is happening in the Earth system. And ultimately, how we're going to incorporate this information into process-based models, specifically Earth system models. And we have to remember that models are a simplification of reality, where we can be as simple as something like this, but ultimately we would like to have a more complex system that will represent the boundless carbon cycle and interactions between the land and the ocean and the aquatic and terrestrial interfaces. The second topic that I want to keep in mind is the idea of this the spatial variability, the temporal variability, and the magnitudes of these transfers of these fluxes, and specifically in the carbon cycle, and ultimately, what are the drivers of them? I think a lot of the research that we have been doing are involving on these three topics, and this has implications for monitoring of blue carbon, ultimately carbon management, carbon markets, quantification of drivers, and how to include these into process-based models. And the last thing to think about, it is this quote. This is a paper published by Smith and Brown in 1931, Agronomy Journal. And this is a paper about soil respiration. Soil respiration is the CO2 efflux from soils to the atmosphere. And I will read this quote, and it says, "One of the chief difficulties encountered in the work has been the development of adequate methods. And from time to time, these methods have been devised, but each has left something to be desired." 1931. And I feel that this quote is something that we deal a lot of the time. We always talk about, or not always, but we think about developing new methods. And we have been developing methods for many years, but there's always now that what we need to do better in terms of technical developments. And I think this is specifically the case for carbon cycle science in terrestrial aquatic interfaces, estuaries, salt marshes, and everything related to blue carbon. With that said, I want to introduce to the second state of the carbon cycle report, the SOCR2. Maybe many of you have know about this report. Maybe some of you have been or were co-authors or participants in this report. This report was sponsored by the US Global Change Research Program and was published in 2018. The idea of this report was to provide a current state of the science of the carbon cycle across North America. And North America understanding what was the United States, Canada, and Mexico. This was an effort of multidisciplinary research that included experimental information, observational, and modeling studies within the last decade. And then this report was written for a diverse audience, from scientists to decision makers, public, the private sectors, and communities across the three countries. Of course, this information is applicable to other systems and other regions around the world. So I had the opportunity to be part, co-chapter lead of chapter 2, which was a synthesis study or a synthesis chapter of all the different pools of carbon on these components across North America. And this chapter can be summarized with this diagram. And this diagram is showing the fluxes as vertical arrows, like these ones. Also the changes in the stocks within these boxes, and the lateral fluxes with these arrows. Of course, the arrows are pointing towards the atmosphere. Is a release of CO2 from this, in this case, will be inland waters to the atmosphere. And if it's an arrow coming to this box, it's an uptake, as is mentioned in here. And then, of course, the lateral flux is moving from this box to this one. The second thing to think about are these asterisks. And the more asterisks that you have, like in this case, is a way to represent how confident we were on the assessment of this number. So, for example, in fossil fuel emissions, this number we have high confidence, but in another number, let's say this one, we have low confidence. For today's talk, I want to focus on this part of diagram, where we have the tidal wetlands and the estuaries. This summary was done in 2018, and SOCR assessments would need to be performed in a constant basis, assessing the published information. And then even in between 2018 to now, there have been a lot of developments in terms of publications that have provided information on that could be useful to improve these numbers. So please keep in mind that this assessment was for the state of the art in 2018. That said, This is very important in developing the science, but also in understanding our knowledge gaps. We can see that the lateral flux from tidal wetlands to the estuaries, we have low confidence on these flux. We have relatively low confidence also in the potential outgassing from estuaries to the atmosphere, and some medium confidence in the uptake of tidal wetlands. That said, understanding these fluxes and the changes in the stocks is very important for carbon markets and blue carbon accounting, etc. And this is where we have been focusing our efforts in the last few years. The story is not just about CO2, as you are aware, it's also about methane. So for the soccer report, we mentioned methane, and we were able to report from the literature that most of this methane emissions were coming from wetlands. But there is an issue. When we did this assessment for North America, most of the wetlands represent freshwater wetlands. And there was very limited information about brackish wetlands or coastal wetlands. So this assessment would need to be revisited also with the new information that is coming about methane emission from different coastal ecosystems. Also, something that is missing from this report and is open for discussion is to have an assessment like this one, but for methane. And how, let's go back again to this part of the diagram, how methane is being either as a potential uptake, at least for terrestrial ecosystems, or releases from estuaries or tidal wetlands, and then if there's any lateral flux of methane from one ecosystem to the next, which is an interesting concept that has not been widely explored. So we expect that maybe in the next soccer report and other assessments, we can have more information from the state of the art of methane emissions of all the many studies that are coming in the last years. So again, keeping in mind these three challenges, boundless carbon cycle, development of adequate methods, and to understand the spatial temporal variability, the magnitudes and drivers of the carbon cycle. And the challenge is, how are we going to do that? And I may not have a specific answer for all of you. I'm happy to discuss different approaches, but I'm going to tell you how my group is exploring some of these parts of these challenges at our study site, and how we are contributing to the advancement of science on these specific topics. Our research site, it is the St. John's Reserve. St. John's Reserve is part of the Delaware National Estuarine Research Reserve, as I mentioned, that it's part of the NERS, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. And there is a map of those reserves across the United States. The NER is right here in Delaware. So if we make a close-up of Delaware, state of Delaware, the capital is Dover. South of Dover, that is the study site. And the St. John's Reserve, it's a salt marsh, and is dominated by spartina alterniflora. This is a zoom of the study site, and most of our research has been done around this footprint. There's an aerial view of the reserve. This is the Delaware Bay, the St. John's River. You see the salt marsh, and there are some creek channels that go and flow into the marsh. There's mainly where we were measuring around this area here. And we try to study different components of this ecosystem. We study soil atmosphere interactions. So we measure with chambers, put these chambers on top of the soil, and we try to measure fluxes. In this specific case, they are automated chambers, so they open and close automatically. They do the work for us in terms of measuring 24/7. We also do manual measurements and automated measurements from fluxes from the creeks, like in this area here. I'm trying to see the emissions from water to the atmosphere. And also we use a micrometeorological technique. It's called the eddy covariance technique to measure the exchange of mass and energy between the whole ecosystem and the atmosphere. So with this technique, we can see the breathing of the ecosystem, but we don't know exactly where they are coming from. This is from the plants, from the soils, from the water. We see an integration of how the ecosystem is breathing, but then with other point measurements, we can start attributing some of these fluxes. It's either they are from soils or from the plants or from the water. And hopefully with that, we can start putting a story together about when the emissions are happening and from which surface they are happening, and which are the patterns in terms of time, space, and hopefully integrating into which are the drivers. This tower, this eddy covariance tower, and these measurements that we do at the study site, they're not unique around the world. There are actually many sites around the world, especially measuring methane. This is a study, but it just got published this year about a compilation of sites measuring ecosystem scale fluxes using the eddy covariance technique across the world. But you can see that from 79 sites that are registered or actually at least sharing data to this network, only 5 are salt marshes, and they have about 10 site years, so about two years of information per each site. Of course, we have now more information, and other sites have more information, but that needs to be compiled into this database and be shared and analyzed. We can see that most of the salt marsh fluxes are on the low end, only from 5 sites, as I was saying. So more information is needed. And in most of the analysis, this information from salt marshes is excluded because the patterns that are observed on these ecosystems are different from the patterns observed in other terrestrial ecosystems. So most of the synthesis and the information that is being compiled and the drivers that are being analyzed from these databases, it is from freshwater, wetlands, or terrestrial ecosystems. So there is a niche for opportunities and research in salt marshes or in blue carbon ecosystems, because things may not follow the same patterns and the same expectations as in freshwater wetlands or terrestrial ecosystems. So with this information at the ecosystem scale and the breathing of the salt marsh, we had a study led by Alma Vázquez-Lully, a PhD student in my research group. And this is the summary of what was measured within 3 years of ecosystem scale measurements. And what we found is that for these 3 years, this site was a net source of carbon to the atmosphere. With annual emissions of these numbers for carbon as CO2 and this number of carbon as methane fluxes. And these diagrams show when and the magnitudes of the fluxes. So for example, this is a green up, and NE represents the net ecosystem exchange. That means is how much CO2 is either going up or to the atmosphere or being assimilated by the ecosystem. So a negative number in this case represents that it's an uptake of CO2, a net uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere into the ecosystem. And if it's a positive number, in this case, it will be a net release of CO2 from the ecosystem to the atmosphere. In this case, it will be the net ecosystem exchange, and these arrows with this bracket represents the methane. So we were able to divide the year in different phases of the canopy. So the green up, maturity, senescence, and then dormancy. And you can see how these fluxes and the magnitude of these fluxes change. And during the green up and the maturity, the ecosystem behaves as a net sink of CO2, but a small or medium source of methane to the atmosphere. But then by senescence and the dormancy, the ecosystem becomes a net source of CO2 to the atmosphere, specifically during the dormancy, very large season. This has implications because when do we measure? usually we concentrate our measurements in the green up and maturity season because it's when the ecosystems are growing, are active. But if we miss our measurements during the senescence or dormancy period, we may be misrepresenting the these longer seasons that could add up for carbon accounting. In this case, the system, the carbon that was simulated during the green up and maturity was not kept, let's call it that way, during the senescence and dormancy. Basically, the emissions during the seasons were larger than the uptake. And that has implications, as I said, for carbon accounting. Of course, this has to be performed during multiple years. We have now 6 years time series, and we will repeat this analysis to understand if this is a consistent pattern in this ecosystem, or if this is going to be just something that we observed in this specific 3 years. This is a complicated diagram, but I want to bring your attention about modeling of these fluxes. And again, I'm trying to identify the drivers, but the take-home message of these diagrams are that net NE or CO2 is relatively easier to represent in comparison to methane. So we can model CO2 with we can explain 79% of the variability, but only 43% of the variability of methane. So modeling of methane is probably more complicated than we think. And how we're going to incorporate this into models, into process-based models, that's an open question and a fine frontier for prediction and for accounting. But the eddy covariance technique measures, as I was mentioning, the breathing of the ecosystem at the ecosystem scale. And we want to find some attribution, or at least how is the spatial variability of the different surfaces of the ecosystem. So this is a study that was led by my student, Vladimir Trifunovic. And he decided to study the fluxes from the water from a creek to the atmosphere. And he was able to design an automated system to measure continuously CO2 fluxes and methane fluxes from the water. And these are the results. One of the interesting results is that for CO2, these are concentrations of CO2, the concentration of methane, and these are the fluxes. So the concentrations of CO2 in the water, they were over 9,000, in many cases, or 9,000 micromole. That's a lot of CO2 in the water. And then when we look at the methane, we were also surprised because there are many days, the concentrations were over 2,000 micromoles from in the water. So what is happening with this methane and with this CO2? If this CO2 is being, and this methane is being released to the atmosphere, or is being transferred laterally to the coastal ocean? They have many studies done about the transfer of dissolving organic carbon from the wetlands into the coastal ocean, but there's not much known about the lateral transfer of methane from coastal wetlands into the ocean. So this is an interesting aspect of measuring this hyperconcentration of methane in the water, and for how long it stays there, and if it makes it to the coastal ocean, that's an open question. And these are just the results of the fluxes, but we have to put into perspective these fluxes in comparison to the whole ecosystem. So in this graph, is a summary of the different seasons, so dormant, the green up, maturity, and senescence. And what are the magnitudes of the CO2 fluxes at the ecosystem scale, like in these boxes, from the creek and from sediments? You're only thinking from soils to the atmosphere. And in most seasons, the ecosystem scale fluxes were higher than any of these other components, except during the dormant season, where the creek, it is an important source of CO2 towards the atmosphere. It's a hot spot of CO2. And for methane, we didn't have information from the sediment to the atmosphere. Remember, these are automated measurements, so they were measuring 24/7. But these are from the ecosystem scale. And at the ecosystem scale, we again see these methane emissions during the senescence. But the creek seems, although there's some seasonality, as you see here, they are relatively low for CO2 in comparison with what the ecosystem represents. So what I think is really fun to do this type of research is to understand the pieces of the puzzle and try to put together, like, where is this methane coming from? Where is it going? Where is the CO2 coming from? What is happening? And this is just a very narrow snapshot of what is happening with the water fluxes. We did the same thing also with manual measurements from the sediments to the atmosphere. That's only for CO2. Why this is important? When we do accounting of carbon and measuring, we try to do the best that we can in the representation of the spatial variability and the temporal variability. And manual measurements are something that is relatively easy to do. It covers a space, but it has a trade-off because we are limited in time measurements. And arguably, there is a very high variability of in temporal variability in terms of CO2 and methane fluxes. So one question is, do we get the same information from manual measurement and from automated measurements? This is a study led by Maya Capucci, and she installed automated measurements of CO2 from measurement from soil to the atmosphere, as I was mentioning, for 2 years in 2 different sites in this ecosystem. And then in the same location, did manual measurements. So the idea is that you get the same information from manual measurements and automated measurements, at least you hope so. The first thing that she studied were what we call functional relationships. So if we look at the relationship with temperature and the flux, we hope to find the similar relationships. And surprisingly, no, and happily, we found that, yes, we have very similar functional relationships from manual measurements and automated measurements. And this is really good because then you can apply this information for modeling fluxes for a full year, but also for accounting. So if we put this together, then we are in the right track. You don't need to measure everything everywhere all the time. Maybe you can have a survey and hopefully get a good idea of your fluxes, in this case for CO2 and for CO2 efflux from soil to the atmosphere. The story is a little bit more complicated. And these are, again, the different seasons: green up, maturity, senescence, dormant. And these are daily cycles, so DL cycles from 0 to 24 hours for each one of the seasons, different days. And this is the water level in terms of in blue color, and the other line is the CO2 efflux on 2 different locations in the salt marsh. And in terrestrial ecosystems, usually CO2 fluxes from soils to the atmosphere have a DL pattern because they are regulated by temperature variability, but also by plant photosynthesis. So we look at this and we didn't find that DL patterns for CO2. And that is challenging because what are the drivers that are contributing to that variability? Because it's not related to temperature, it's not related necessarily to photosynthesis, it's not related to tides. When we look closer also with methane fluxes at this scale, there are also not very clear patterns. So again, this creates some challenges for modeling. But going back to the idea that, well, maybe there are some functional relationships that are similar from manual measurements and automated measurements, even if you miss these very high frequency variability of DL patterns. So if these functional relationships are comparable, if I model the fluxes, maybe I can get to a similar number for carbon accounting. And the answer is it depends. So if we compare the annual fluxes from manual measurements and automated measurements, when we model these using a simple relationship with temperature, we found that manual measurements underestimate annual flux between 23 and 67%. And here is a problem, because even if we get a similar information in terms of mean magnitudes, we get information about spatial variability of these fluxes, we get similar information about functional relationships. When we put everything together, there's a large discrepancy for carbon accounting. And this is something that we need to be aware of, and we need to explore more about how we integrate the information that we have from manual measurements that can integrate space, but they don't have high temporal resolution, and automated measurements that they have high temporal resolution, but we cannot measure everything everywhere all the time. We did a similar study, but now trying to see the different components of the ecosystem. So what we tried to do here was understand the fluxes at the ecosystem scale. Again, we have NE, net ecosystem scale, net ecosystem exchange, and GPP. In this case, we can model the uptake of carbon from the atmosphere to the land by photosynthesis, ecosystem respiration, all the fluxes of CO2 to the atmosphere, and also the fluxes of methane. The black lines represents the measurements from the ecosystem scale with the eddy covariance technique, and the color lines represent models based from manual measurements. When we look at the relationship between our manual measurements and the eddy covariance measurements, we actually find very strong relationships. We see these numbers is the first guess will be that we are able to represent the spatial variability very well, and measurements compare from plot measurements to the ecosystem scale. Again, the problem is when we try to upscale this information at the annual sum. So for any, the story is complicated because manual measurements overestimate an uptake of CO2 by over 100%. But for GPP and ecosystem respiration, it's about 15% of an overestimate or underestimate. And methane, again, we have a problem. It's an underestimate of about 70%, where we have a lot of problems in terms of trying to replicate the temporal variability, but also the magnitudes. So these are examples of opportunities that we have in terms of coupling ecosystem scale measurements with point measurements, how when we try to analyze these relationships, there are some good news in terms of agreement, but also when we upscale this information, there are challenges, again, for carbon accounting on these different components. So are we there yet? And the question is, which are the implications for modeling and accounting? And this is something that has been discussed recently, and that methane and nitrous oxide emissions complicate these assessments. And we have done a little bit of this. This is again a study that was Maggie Capucci did it a few years ago, where she was measuring automated measurements of CO2 and nitrous oxide in this case, and we found that there is a lot of temporal variability. So where to measure and when to measure. And things get very complicated for methane and even more complicated for nitrous oxide. So carbon accounting, how we put all these things together and how we can do this. So what about ammonia? This is not something that we talk too much about this, but it's something that we've had the opportunity to work in collaboration with Nebila Lishingheb, and NOAA scientists, and we were able to measure ammonia emissions using the eddy covariance technique, so at ecosystem scale. This is a summary of the results, where there are appear to be a DL pattern of ammonia emissions that is different, from the CO2 DL patterns, and methane is kind of flat in this case. And it may or may not be related to the water level, where at high water level, then ammonia emissions they decrease. This is one of the first studies in the world looking at these ammonia emissions. This was only a 2-week experiment, but it gives some insights about that this is possible, but also it requires more measurements to be compared with other ecosystems or with other sites around the world, but also in this specific site to have long-term measurements. But we have to think about maybe multi-sensor remote sensing. So this is not just about the ground measurements. We were able to work with NASA scientists as well. There's the NASA Carbon Airborne Flux Experiment. It's called CARAFE. And it is an airborne eddy covariance. And these are the flight paths across the Delmarva. And we were able to contribute data from our site here. One of the main results is that the eddy covariance towers capture about 30 to 70% of the regional variability of the fluxes. That's pretty good. So this gives information that if we have a network of towers, we may have a good information about this, the regional variability that can be corroborated with airborne measurements. But comparing what is happening from an airplane and what's in the ground is challenging. This is our study site, and these are the results of CO2. And here are our site, and this is the network of sites. So these are promising results that this technique can be used to reconcile measurements from top down in the airplanes, but also from bottom up for the regional approaches. But for methane, we have limited information, and the picture is a little bit more complicated, as has been mentioning. But it's complicated because the footprint of a tower is not necessarily what the airplane is seeing, because you are seeing from the airplane a combination of different landscape, not only the wetlands. You might be seeing information from croplands and forests, and that complicates the approach. But combining multi-sensors and multi-approaches is something that is very useful. We also combine information from images at the site level. This is phenocam, which are pictures of the landscape. In this case, it's a picture taken yesterday. And from this, we can extract information from different vegetation indices. We can, as our site, we can combine the information from the cameras. These are different point of view, of course, but also with satellite information. And again, you hope that there is agreement between these measurements. So we can also compare some benchmarks for the measurements of net ecosystem exchange, or at the ecosystem scale, where we have how much carbon is being when does carbon start being uptake, and when there is a senescence, and hopefully we don't need to be measuring maybe the carbon dynamics at the site level with these micrometeorological techniques. Maybe we only need to have monitoring networks with cameras or by satellites, and if they can identify these trends of when is the green up and when is the senescence, we can find design networks, and we can get information from its ecosystems across different sites. But it is complicated as well, because we can develop many indices, but when we compare them for the length of the carbon season at one of the at the site, we see that not all the sensors work well, especially remote sensing techniques. But it seems that the phenocam provide the best monitoring approach. So we advocate that maybe a simple camera like the phenocams, which are the security cameras, can be deployed in many ecosystems, and it could be a relatively easy way to measure the carbon dynamics in at least salt marshes. And developing this network could be something interesting, an interesting discussion, and relatively cost-effective, I would say. And finally, I want to end this discussion with an idea of coastal observatories. So maybe some of you, or most of you, are familiar with NEON, the National Ecological Observatory Network. But NEON is limited to mostly terrestrial ecosystems, and coastal ecosystems have been left behind. And there has been some talks about developing this coastal observatory. But how are we going to do this? Thinking about these three challenges: do we have the methods set and we know exactly what is happening? Do we are ready to do or integrate the land and ocean interfaces? Do we have enough information for measuring and identifying these drivers? Also, we have to think about ideas for carbon management, and do we have enough information at the appropriate scale? So how much spatial information we need to solve for carbon management, to be useful, to provide information that is actually useful for land managers. This is a study that a student in my group, Jocelyn Wardrop, is working on, developing soil carbon maps in coastal wetlands at 3-meter spatial resolution. Is this enough? How is the accuracy of these results? And there's a big challenge when we compare these numbers of hyperspatial resolution of soil carbon when we compare it with national estimates of soil carbon or global estimates. Again, is this enough? How deep we need to go? And if we can develop observatories or monitoring networks, how can we incorporate all that information for modeling approaches? And can models handle this hyperspatial resolution, or when do we stop? Those are interesting questions that will require organization for developing monitoring networks and or observatories. And I want to end the talk with some challenges of what I call the interoperability barriers. You probably have heard the word interoperability, but we get stuck into technical aspects. But if we're going to develop observatory networks, we have to think about different barriers. The first one is what I call the conceptual barrier. The conceptual barrier is what is going to be the network design? What are the sampling protocols? Yeah. And this is something that I think this community can think about, like, what do we really need to measure, and how are we going to do that from a conceptual approach? And then the second one is a technological barrier, which is how are we going to do it, and which techniques are we going to apply to measure and get the results that we need for moving forward. Another barrier is organizational barriers. Who is going to do what? And this is a big issue. It's like, which is the responsibility? Who is going to be able to get funding? Who is going to be a stakeholder? Who is going to be aware of making a stronger compatibility among institutions and do not duplicate efforts? And finally, there are cultural barriers. Cultural barriers, there would be if challenges that may exist among communities, such as if we're looking at different stakeholders from the science perspective or from the policymakers, what are the goals of these two communities? Maybe we have some struggles of resources, of lack of trust among actors. What are we going to be data sharing policies, etc. So the idea is that if we're going to move forward to an integration of network information, the idea is to reduce these barriers of interoperability to make a stronger network and move forward in our knowledge for developing monitoring networks. With that, I want to say thank you very much again to support the sponsors of this work, people that have helped along the way, and students. And I think we have a little bit of time for discussion. I'm very happy to answer any questions, either today by chat, or we can follow by email if there is interest on that.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Vargas. You've given us a lot of food for thought here, especially those of us working on blue carbon projects and thinking about these kind of monitoring efforts, which are so critical to that process of bringing one of those projects to market. So certainly some things we need to take into account and think about as we're designing projects. There are some questions coming in. If I could be so bold, I have got one I want to start with, and that is taking the work that you've done in Delaware. Delaware is a climate that is very much temperate, but it is not a super cold winter. How do you take the findings that you have from Delaware, and how do they relate to, for example, a place in Massachusetts where you're going to have a really hard freeze and that water is likely to be frozen and the soil frozen solid through the winter, or comparing it to a place like South Carolina where the cold season is much shorter and the growing season is longer? How would you compare these findings to different types of climates?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think that is a typical question on any scientific result, that how applicable and how broad it is, no? And the short answer is, I would encourage everyone to go out there in the winter and do measurements. And I know it's not nice, but that is a big challenge with automated measurements and manual measurements. Automated measurements, these instruments, they sample day and night. If it's raining, if it's cold, there are mosquitoes, they will be out there. And many of our measurements, manual measurements, are when we are able to go, and there are some limitations. So winter fluxes is something that is, there's not much information about it. So my first guess is I encourage people to go out and do that. That said, is how we extrapolate things. It's hard to say because there are different ecosystems. There are different processes, as you said. There are different conditions during in the winter. But what our results show is that winter fluxes are important and they cannot be neglected. So when we do monitoring and accounting, it will be important to look at that season where we think everything is dormant is not. Things are happening and the ecosystem is active. How much, where are the drivers? That's something that it will be site specific, and we need more information about that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to some of the questions coming in. First question, are there plans to compare results from this specific, I guess this is related to what I just asked, to this specific marsh to others in the area? Are there studies in the region that are comparative? Do they show that the other salt marshes are a net source rather than a sink? Are there any comparative analyses you could speak to or direct our listeners to?
Yeah, no, this is great. So there are many scientists in the region that are working on measuring ecosystem scale CO2 fluxes. We have been trying to get a network of sites in North Carolina, Virginia, New Jersey, Massachusetts, to get together and make this possible. But this is a network that is just starting, and it's I mean, we hope to have the results. But if it just names, I can name some scientists. There is Tom O'Halloran, there is Chris Goch, there is Inke Forbich, and Karina Sheffer. Those are nearby scientists that are measuring with similar technique in different salt marshes in the neighborhood, and their results are upcoming. They have published other ones already, mainly with CO2, less information about methane, but we hope to see these results coming in the next couple of years.
Great. Okay, thank you. Next question. How do you think sediment supply to the salt marsh or any hypothetical marsh would affect your carbon findings? Yeah,
so that's a very interesting question as well, and it goes into the discussion about lateral transport, and that is a big uncertainty. So most of the results that are presented, especially at the ecosystem scale, are vertical fluxes, but this lateral transport, especially from sediments, it is a big question. So sediments coming into the ecosystem and sediments going out of the ecosystem, that's a big, this is a large mass that is moving laterally that we have to account. So the short answer would be, we need to measure that. I don't know. It will be dependent on the ecosystem, but we cannot neglect vertical and lateral fluxes, specifically lateral fluxes that account for a large uncertainty in the North American carbon budget.
Okay, next question. Can you describe the automated chamber for the water atmosphere interface? And from the same individual, how could NH3 affect CO2 or CH4 emissions? Is that study you mentioned published? So I think that was one of your students, that one of your students' work you were referencing.
Yeah, so ammonia measurements, that was an add-on study that we wanted to highlight, meaning that there are many trace gases that can be measured. We mentioned that CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, but there are other ones that can be measured in collaboration with scientists. In this case, was with NOAA, that can be added, and we'll finding those relationships with other patterns in other trace gases. It's a science frontier. Now the specific one on the fluxes from, you mentioned the water to the atmosphere, is that correct?
Well, so what they asked is, can you describe the automated chamber? I think this is the eddy covariance method that perhaps is not familiar.
No, I believe the question was with the water to the atmosphere. Is that the specific?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So yes, so that study is published. It was published by Vladimir Trifunovic last year in Journal of Geophysical Research-Biogeosciences. And it was not a chamber. Actually, it was using solid state sensors. So we were able to submerge a sensor for CO2 and a sensor for methane. And those sensors were measuring the concentration of CO2 and the methane. And then we developed a model using the concentration, the piston velocity to calculate the fluxes of CO2 and methane. That model was calibrated with floating chambers. So you can back engineer using fixed first law of diffusion, knowing the concentration and the flux, you can calculate the piston velocity. And with that, you can calculate a flux. So it was not a chamber, it was from concentrations, automated measurements of concentrations, and using a model using the piston velocity. And that is in it is published and described in the paper that I mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Someone is asking if the recording will be available. Yes, we should have that up by the end of the week. I've read literature showing that methane emissions in salt marshes are salinity dependent. How might changing salinities in estuaries play into these estimates, particularly when freshwater inputs are changing as a result of climate change?
Yeah, that is a really good question. It is a topic of research. Yeah, but I just want to discuss that in general. Methane emissions have been related with concentrations of salinity, and it's expected that if you have higher salinity, it's expected to have lower methane emissions because that affects the redox ladder. That said, there are many different pathways for methanogenesis. It's not only the methanogenesis going to be inhibited by salt, by higher concentration in salt. There are other pathways such as methyl methanogenesis. And those are pathways that have not been explored that much that allows methanogenesis and production of methane under higher salinity conditions. So what I think is the story is going to be more interesting because there's more to discover in terms of the biochemistry of methane dynamics, but we have to start from what we know. So the short answer is yes, there's the methanogenesis inhibited in general by higher salinity, but we need to understand other potential pathways that microorganisms can take in case salinity concentrations changes. And the intensity of those pathways and the intensity of the production, is that going to be important for higher or lower emissions of methane? That is an open question for research.
Okay, thank you so much. I've got a response. Fascinating. Thank you. We are coming up on the hour, so I think we need to call it here. We have had several requests for your slides. Now, I know some of this is your student data. Are you in a position to share the slides that we might be able to pass those along to viewers?
Yeah, I can talk with you about that offline.
Okay, all right, great. We'll follow up, and if folks are interested, what I would ask is please get in touch with me personally. Again, my name is Hillary Stevens. I'm the Coastal Resilience Manager here at Restore America's Estuaries. And this has been our monthly webinar series with Professor Rodrigo Vargas of the University of Delaware. This has been a really fascinating and informative talk. I want to thank you again for your time, for preparing this and sharing all of your and your students' data with us, and for taking our questions. So thank you again. And again, for folks interested in the recording, this will be available in the next few days on our website and at our YouTube channel.